Hi everyone, I'm Abeba Amro-Selassie, the head of the IMF's African department, welcoming you to Africa Perspectives, where we discuss pressing economic policy issues faced by regional leaders. Today, it is my profound honor to introduce to you a luminary in the domains of democracy, governance, public sentiment surveys, and development in Africa, Professor Emmanuel Guillema Boadi, a figure whose scholarly and practical contributions have significantly shaped our understanding of democratic governance and influenced public opinion across our continent. Professor Guillema Boadi is a visionary who co-founded Afrobarometer, a Pan-African, non-partisan research network that measures public attitudes on economic, political, and social matters in Africa. Serving as its executive director between 2008 and 2021. He has now transitioned to chair the board of directors, continuing to steer this tremendous project towards illuminating the voices of millions of Africans. His journey in fostering democratic ideals began much earlier with the founding of the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. This institution stands as a testament to his commitment to advancing democracy, good governance, and rule of law in Ghana and well beyond. His expertise and insights have also been recognized at prestigious institutions in the US, including School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C., the Center for Democracy, Rule of Law and Development at Stanford University, the Wilson Center, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the United States Institute of Peace. Today, we hope to delve into the pressing issues facing democracy in Africa, the quest for genuine democratic governance, the critical role of infrastructure investment and the provision of public services, and the impact of global politics on Africa's development trajectory, guided by his powerful insights. Please join me in welcoming Professor Guillema Boadi, a true champion of democracy and development in Africa. Welcome, Emmanuel.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. If I may jump straight into my question for you. What inspired you to set up African Barometer? And importantly also, how did you go about doing this? And what do you feel have its contributions been?
So in 1998, two colleagues of mine, Professor Mike Bratton and Dr. Robert Mattis, we meet at a conference on democracy in African democratization in Johannesburg. And on the sidelines of that meeting, we found ourselves talking about the state of democracy in Africa and lamenting the huge lacuna in public opinion opinion surveys on African attitudes to all these monumental reforms that were taking place at the time. Initially, the neoliberal economic reforms of the 80s and 90s, and then following the fall of the Berlin Wall, the democratization movement. And we realized as political scientists, we all got caught unawares because up to that time, nobody had a clue what the ordinary African thought about these issues. And instead, we sort of substituted our own views and opinions as experts, as scholars, as pundits, as if those represented the views of the ordinary African. So we said, well, since I was doing some surveys, experimenting with them in Ghana, Mike Bratton was doing something on Zimbabwe, Bob Mattis was working on citizen surveys in South Africa. We thought it would be good to get some sort of systematic comparative perspectives on these issues across Africa. So we applied to grant makers and got lucky with a grant to start in the first 12 African countries in 1999.
And right now, how many countries do you cover, and how frequent are the surveys?
So currently, we cover 30. The last round, we covered 39 countries. We are aiming to do like 40 or a little bit above 40 in in the ongoing round, which we call round 10.
Okay.
So we do a round of survey about every 2 years, 2.5, sometimes 3 years. But we, of course, repeat many of the questions in order to get to track those same opinions over time. And we also introduce some new modules on topical issues that come up. And sometimes we drop some of the questions if we are getting the same responses, and then we drop them for a while, return to them later to see if opinions and attitudes to those issues have changed in the time that we stop asking the question.
Thank you for those words. I remember well the halcyon days of excitement on the shift towards more democratic forms of government in the early 90s. I was just starting out my career. And with the 30 odd years on, how do you see the health of democracy in the region? Let me hear your thoughts, and then I will maybe interject.
Well, first, I know these days there's a lot of despair over the state of democracy and governance in Africa once again. But I think, as somebody who's been involved in the Afrobarometer for now a quarter of a century, I'll be remiss if I don't point out that, there's been a lot of progress all across Africa. We started in 12, we could only cover 12 countries in 1999 in the first round of the survey, because those were the countries that were relatively politically open, sufficiently politically open enough, that were peaceful enough that you could send out your enumerators to go throughout the country and survey, come home and sleep in their own beds. The fact that we are doing 39 to 40 countries today suggests an Africa that is far more politically open in 2024 than it was in 1999. And I think we should not lose sight of that. Second, the Afrobarometer survey instrument is very politically sensitive. It's asking people to rate their government's performance, levels of corruption, to assess levels of corruption, to say whether the last elections were free and fair, whether they think their government is any good or not. The fact that we're able to ask all of these questions and governments, by and large, cooperate with us, or at least tolerate us, it's another sign of greater openness. And then, mind you, we use census data. We draw the sample from the National Census Frame. Again, everywhere we go these days, a little bit of challenge every once in a while, but we do get the cooperation of census authorities to access the data, the census data, get the enumeration maps and so on. That's another sign of governments either tacitly or directly cooperating and collaborating with an institution like the Afrobarometer. So that's, for me, a sign of progress. And then we disseminate the results locally. So again, these findings are sometimes highly unflattering to the government of the day. They will have and puff about some finding or another, but again, with the exception of Burundi, for instance, we haven't been able to go back because government was unhappy with the release of some of the findings. But here we're still going in 40 countries.
That's excellent to put things in perspective, because I know there's some disappointment elsewhere. I'll come to that in a minute. But just
and I will address the disappointments part. So
okay. Just again, we need to go into the details, but one meta question that I have for you is that, sometimes I feel like I'm watching a split screen when I see political developments in the region. On the one hand, we have, as you said, this big improvements, a lot more, I would say, openness, a lot more space for criticism of governments in particular. And then also, importantly though, we have very boisterous, robust democracies which go through electoral cycles, and the outcomes are observed and people broadly satisfied. I have in mind, Senegal most recently, but Ghana, of course, famously every 4 years. You've had this since the early 90s, and many other cases, including countries that were in dire conflict. Like Liberia is a good example, but also Malawi, Zambia, etc., where you see robust, healthy democracies. But on the other hand, of course, we've also, of late, the last couple of years, also seen quite a few democratically elected governments being overthrown by coups, by the military in particular, and and that has not led to massive protests to bring elected governments back, possibly due to suppression, but there's been this reversal, if you will, of this trend in some countries, and a non-trivial one. What are your thoughts on this juxtaposition of these developments?
So some of it speaks to a gap in the people's aspiration to live under governments that are democratic and accountable versus what you economists may call supply versus how much of this thing that they say they want and desire is being delivered to them. So, we've been tracking for, let's say, for over 30 countries for which we have a 10-year overtime data on it. Basically, the demand for democracy, democratic and accountable governance has stayed fairly strong. Support for democracy, which is relatively weak today, is still 2/3 of the average adult African citizenry. Supply is often lagging behind and has been dropping over time. So yes, there's about a 7% drop in over average demand for democracy, support for democracy over a 10-year period, 12-year period, but the supply side is even worse. So so far as we are concerned, it's the supply that citizens are not getting good quality elections. They are not getting a handle on corruption. They are feeling and seeing official impunity, and they are seeing the service supply, service delivery responses continue to lag and actually are lagging even more in the last, let's say, 2 or 3 survey cycles. Just to make a point, about the economics of things.
Yeah.
We've been tracking we have an index called lived poverty, a lived poverty index, degree of deprivation of medicine, medical care when you needed it, of food when you needed it, water, clean water when you needed it, fuel when you needed it, cash income when you needed it. And for a while, the numbers that were the percentage of citizens in each country that we surveyed, which were suffering these deprivations, was declining up to about, let's say, 2018, thereabout, and then in the more recent cycles of the survey, deprivation levels are going up again. And I think some of the dismay with democratically elected politicians and governments arise from this. The fact that corruption perception continues to grow, and in some cases, grow exponentially between, in a 10 years survey cycle, suggests that, if you live in South Africa, for instance, you saw you rated corruption at the presidency, you assessed that to be really, really high by 2022 or so. And then that seemed to drive your level of satisfaction with the way democracy works in your country.
That's brilliant insight backed by fairly comprehensive data, it seems. I'm trying to link this a little bit with what has been happening globally. Also, do you compare what's happening in our countries to political developments elsewhere? Because it seems of a piece to what we're seeing happening in some European countries, for example, maybe even here. But any thoughts you have on this, please?
So, first, we do have a network of the barometers. Not Europe so much, but we have Latino barometer as part of the network. We call ourselves the global barometer.
Yeah.
And Southeast Asia, New Asia, and so on. When it comes to that, it is still the case that African support for democracy, the attraction of democratic governance to Africans continues to be much stronger than in other regions of the world. And I suspect that if you were to bring Europe in and North America, Africa will still be an exception in that regard. So there is that fact. But it's also the case that I think when you see democratically elected leaders in Africa misconducting themselves, not delivering on democracy and accountable governance, and sometimes you see reversals in the forms of coup d'etat and so on, it's also a function of the fact that today they feel they can get away with it. They are not going to get strong pushback from the African Union as it was trying to do by about 2015 or so. It will get no pushback. If it's a West African country where a coup occurs, the pushback will be weaker today than it was in the days of Obasanjo, Kufuor, Abdoulaye Wade, and so on. So, and then, best of all, they are not going to get serious pushback from the G7 countries, from the United States, from the West in general, that has since about since about the global financial crisis of the late 2000s, they basically have been turning their attention away from promoting and supporting democratic reforms in Africa. They are now more focused on countering China, securing energy and market buffers, and maybe dealing with Ukraine or Gaza or somewhere. So Africa has fallen off their radar, and in the meantime, mischief makers, adventurers and others take advantage.
Okay. So, so many questions for you. So maybe let's start with this, the idea, which I find powerful, of democratic supply deficit, that we are seeing governments not quite delivering on all of the things that people expect of them. What do you think is the driver for that? Is it, because I do, in some cases, because many of the countries we've seen coups and inadequate supply delivery, I see two forces at work. One is, it's always been the case that these states have had very weak state capacity, ability to implement things, deliver health, education, all the other services that we expect governments to do. That's always been a level condition. So that's one factor. Another one, of course, is that globally, it's been a period of quite a bit of turmoil and commodity prices have been weak for some countries. Even where that's not the case, we've had financing challenges in other countries. I mean, do you attribute the supply deficit to simply bad politics, or a bit more to these exogenous shocks?
So the exogenous shocks do matter, but I think so. If you are in the West Africa Sahel, course, you are dealing with the hugely negative effects of climate change. You are dealing with jihadist insurgencies bearing down on you. You are dealing with all the normal shocks in the international economic system that everybody is dealing with, and so on.
Demographics.
So, and then you are dealing with the huge youth bulge, whose management is challenging. But I think we should also recall an earlier time on the same continent, in some of these same regions that are troubled, when civil conflicts were resolved peacefully, democratically, where peaceful elections were held, and these societies began to experience growth. They began to experience greater social development and experience political stability and the like. So we should be, the way I turn your question around is, whatever happened to move Africa from being a hopeless continent in the terms of the Economist magazine to becoming the hopeful continent 10 years later, we should be going to do archaeological work there and dig to find nuggets of insights and best practices that moved the countries of the continent in those years. And from where I sit, and partly reading the Afrobarometer data over time, it had something to do with the fact that governments were becoming more accountable. Elections did resolve a lot of the disputes about who should govern. It's an imperfect mechanism, but to date, about, let's say, 75, more than 7 out of every 10 Africans will say they prefer the ballot box as the mechanism for choosing governments. It has dropped a little. It used to be like 8 in 10, but still 7 in 10, or more than 7 in 10 is pretty high. So the ballot box still remains a vital mechanism for doing this, for choosing leaders and choosing governments. And so if elections are losing their quality, we should address that. We should work on that. If elections are producing too much tension, we should address that. But we shouldn't drop the baby of elections with the dirty bathwater.
Absolutely. So, in terms of, earlier you also invoked a couple of factors which have maybe
Yes.
added to this wave of movement away from electoral, imperfect elections to address political challenges. One you mentioned is kind of internal to our region, the fact that you've not had big pushback from ECHAS, for example.
Yes.
And the other one, more global
Yes.
factors. Again, I asked you how much this was economics. But I would love to hear a little bit more in terms of why you think ECOWAS, for example, has retreated as an enforcer of good democratic governance. Globally, you mentioned factors like, the geopolitical considerations, perhaps leading to a lifting of the pressure to persist globally. But the latter one, I think less foreign interference maybe is not such a bad thing. But I don't know. I would love to hear your thoughts on these.
We can come to that later.
Okay, but just maybe we start with why you think kind of our regional bodies have eased the pressure.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think maybe it was an accident of history that we have, West Africa had these leaders that somehow had the moral and political capital to deploy towards solving conflicts in a region and pushing leaders to be more and more democratic, to a point where in West Africa, ECOWAS had considered making two-term presidential term limits, two-term limits for presidential tenure, an ECOWAS norm by 2015. That got somehow, they couldn't, because they had to do it by unanimous consent, and one or two of the 14 or so presidents did not sign on to that. We couldn't have that. This was ECOWAS in its golden days. But the question as to why this has suddenly disappeared, I think it's just a misfortune of not having a critical mass of really strong leaders with a strong commitment to democratic principles and understanding that the region will do better if it has sort of fairly uniform political standard in the same way that we are trying to reach fairly uniform economic standards.
I find that argument a little bit, dispiriting. No, I mean, in the sense that, if it was due to the individuals in power at the time,
it helped.
Then maybe it suggests that it may not be repeated.
It could be repeated because, again, if you saw a couple of, I think last year or so, ECOWAS was trying to take a stand with Niger.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it did not succeed. But probably didn't succeed because none of the ECOWAS presidents was willing to step up and say that this is an ECOWAS norm that has been broken. If you want to stay in ECOWAS, these are the rules. If this actually started with the way we started. AU started diluting NEPAD APRM standards, the peer review standards, and then very soon it became a no standard kind of project. ECOWAS is in danger of becoming a no political standard kind of association, and that, I think, is a leadership failure. I think it's an accident of history, but I also think that ECOWAS is still salvageable. Possibly if Tinubu gets a little bit more secure, he might be able to push. The new president of Boakai, I don't know what his attitudes are to regional issues and the like, but the region is just crying for leadership, that's all. In the same way that to some extent the AU is crying for leadership today. But I think I want to say it's an accident of history. It's not structural.
Noted, and your counter arguments also resonate some. On international or global geopolitical factors, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you share the view that less involvement in internal politics is better, or do you still see a role for global entities to be, these electoral missions that people send often to check on the robustness of elections, etc. Do you find those things helpful, or do we need more and more internal, more domestic accountability systems for democratic institution building?
You need both. You need both the domestic, you need robust domestic institutions, both state and non-state ones. I've been an actor on the domestic front in Ghana, on the institution I was a part of until 2018, CDD Ghana. We ran the largest domestic election observers group, and this group has been steadfastly committed to election integrity in Ghana, election peacefulness, election credibility, and now you cannot think of an election in Ghana without CODEO. It is possible, and I think every country can use its version of CODEO in Africa when it comes to election, credible election and watchdogging. You have these civic anti-corruption bodies that sprouted up in the 90s, in the 2000s. I think you need all of them, but you also need state institutions, the Ombudsman and the Attorney General's office and the Justice Administration, all of them working sufficiently well and ideally working together with these non-state bodies. So you need that. But the fact also remains that as Afrobarometer, as CDD Ghana, as CODEO, the progress has been made and effectiveness has been possible because there's also the international environment supported that. So to me, you need both. If the ideal situation is to have both of them working at a certain minimal level to produce good results and continue to do so. And part of the reason why this is the case is that, as you know, governments may be well-intentioned, leaders may be well-intentioned, but they face all kinds of pressures and incentives that may prevent them from doing the right thing. You need both internal and external agencies of restraint.
Yeah.
But the best of all is to also have self-restraint on the part of leaders, democratically elected leaders themselves. So it's a number of factors. It's a well-behaved government, vibrant media and civil society, and a supportive international political and economic environment.
So, to kick the tire a little bit on this, when I look at Ghana, for example, and how you have the very robust civil society organizations, debate, the boisterous debate that you have, versus other countries, say in the Sahel, RCA, where you don't see that as much. How much is this a function of low levels of human capital in the Sahel compared to Ghana, rather than kind of, so just put differently, the fact that you have such robust civil society organizations in Ghana, how much is that a factor of, the really very high level of education you have in Ghana versus some of the neighboring countries?
By the way, let me correct you. I don't want to hold Ghana up as a best example in these things. These days, I actually wish Ghanaian civil society and Ghanaian government and others will learn a lot more from Kenya, for instance. And I think, my best case of a well-governing country today probably will be Zambia. So
in terms of democratic,
in terms of both, democratic governance, in terms of what civil society should do to keep a government on its toes, and sometimes in terms of how the state countervailing institutions should handle the government and to deal with government issues so that government stays on the straight and narrow. So that's my general editorial, that Ghana is slipping.
But you still have, I would say Kenya, Zambia, Ghana, much higher levels of human capital than other countries. So how much is the flourishing of civil society a function of this human capital versus...
It will be.
It would be,
It will be, but again, I don't know if any of us is in a position to grow human capital in, just for lack of a better example, let's say Chad, in the short and medium terms to be able to deliver this. But I think there's learning, there is emulation, there is dissemination of ideas. We all learn from other places and we learn from each other. And I think increasingly, at least in West Africa, there are you are seeing some cross-country learning on the part of, say, West African civil society. My former organization, for instance, has this entity called the West African Democracy Solidarity Network, which has civil society, governance and democracy related civil society bodies in these countries together, and this includes groups in Mali, Niger, and Burkina, and their leaders who meet periodically, go to each other's assistance, offer advice and comfort to each other, and sometimes also bring up their issues when some of their leaders are being hounded by government. So I think we need to do more of this within the continent and across the region, where we are learning from each other and we are picking best practices and trying to practice them in our own countries, but within something that has been grown in a country in the region that is working, as opposed to something that has been grown in France or the United States that you transplant to Ghana.
Excellent point. Turning a little bit more into some of the findings of your survey, which, a little bit more in the economic domain,
Sure.
what I found super interesting is, understandably, when people are surveyed about what are the most important things governments should focus on, you have jobs.
So jobs,
Healthcare.
health, and then these days, especially in the post-COVID era, economic management of the macroeconomy.
So I guess a function of the high inflation we've seen,
Yes.
cost of living.
Yes.
So if you could say a little bit about those things. Is this uniform, or do you see it varying across countries?
So in some of the largely agrarian countries like Malawi, sometimes the principal concern is food security. But for the most part, I think unemployment has been stands out. There's a lot of consistency in citing unemployment as a core issue, but in sometimes infrastructure has come up a little bit to maybe the fourth position, but the picture has stayed largely the same.
I find the fact that governance is not high up among these things quite interesting. But elsewhere, you mentioned how some of the democratic deficit that we see is on account of a perception that corruption governance is very high. How do you explain this dissonance?
It must have something to do with the fact that when you are to an ordinary, even to me, if you ask me, what's the biggest problem that the Ghanaian government should address, I have to put on my policy analysis cap to mention corruption. But off the cuff, I would have to say it's unemployment. I have to say it's inflation or something of that nature. People are not necessarily able to draw a direct link between the deprivations they suffer and the misgovernance within which that is imposed on them. And so that's the job of the analyst. Yeah. And sometimes you do that by also just checking associations, to what extent governments that are getting more and more corrupt, generating more and more unemployment, generating higher inflation, and so on. But that's the second level of analysis. You don't get that by just asking people right away what they wouldn't know the link. And I wouldn't blame them, because I also wouldn't know the link, but for the fact that this is how I earn my living.
Very, very insightful. So, I would be remiss not to follow up and ask, though, how much does the evidence show that indeed where perceptions of, well, not perception, actual corruption is higher, you are seeing also economic outcomes in terms of jobs, etc., being impacted?
Okay, no, frankly, I haven't done, I'm not familiar with this line of inquiry and analysis. It's possible still to try and see what the data says on that, but that has not been done by me, or I haven't read it from any of our analysts.
Okay, so in terms of these peace building, peace sustaining institutions, you mentioned the importance of elections, no matter imperfect as they are, probably the best means to address who should have political power. You also mentioned civil society organizations. What other institutional weaknesses do you observe in the region?
So, I mean, just speaking from Afrobarometer data and insights, there is a very strong popular support for free media and an investigative media. I would understand that to mean people want to see government actions scrutinized better. There's also a strong interest in accessing public information, state information, and our respondents report facing frustrations when they try to access government data. And so for me, that really means whatever we can do to compel governments to make official information more accessible will be giving citizens the tools to use to demand accountability from their government.
And over time, I mean, earlier you mentioned how much kind of, there has been more openness, for example, to doing surveys, to criticism. Is this also an area where you continue to see a significant improvement in your surveys?
Oh, no, I think there's a lot. Governments are finding other ways of clamping, of sort of closing in. So, you find that, of course, the media is pressing, and media is prolific in many countries in Africa today. But it doesn't mean it's a whole lot of government transparency coming out. I think being politicians, they do their best to take, they give with one hand and then they take it back. They will set up the institution, all right, and then they will begin to put screws on the institution so it doesn't deliver to the people the right amount of information. I mean, if you take Ghana, has more recent, like in the last 2017 or 18, passed a right to information law. Its law has been, the advocacy for it took about 20 years, to do. It's out now, but it's still challenging, trying to get information through that. If you read the leaf carefully, yes, there is more. It's possible, if you are savvy enough, you can get information from government through the mechanism of the Right to Information Office, which you couldn't do, say, 10 years ago. But it's in drips. It's in drips.
That's okay. So it's very helpful. One of the interesting aspects of the survey is, for a while now, you've been canvassing views on African attitudes towards China and the US. And one of the interesting findings is that indeed Africans see, both equally favorably.
Yes.
How can our people avoid kind of being God forbid, things become dire, being forced to choose?
Well, I hope Africa is not being forced to choose. And I don't think Africa is being forced to choose. Rather, it is government leaders, incumbent governments, its presidents who choose. Unfortunately, they choose largely on the basis of political expediency. And so, just again, think of the 2000s when governments made a choice, for instance, to either sign on to the HIPIC program or not sign on to the HIPIC program based on what they thought it would do for their countries. Countries like Ghana that went for the HIPIC relief were able to do quite a lot for their countries in a relatively short period of time. We engage in these social, introduce these social distribution, social insurance programs and others. So if today the same Ghanaian government decided that its choice of alliance between China and the United States, for instance, will be based on the benefits that will accrue to the country as opposed to the benefits that will accrue to the political regime, then we'll be in a good place. So I think where you choose to go is not as important as why you choose to do so, and whether your choice is based on serving your people versus serving yourself and your partisans. As you know, in recent time, and you at the IMF will understand very well this analogy. When some African governments had a choice between World Bank, IMF loan facilities versus going for Eurobond, they went for Eurobond because that's a speakeasy version, and basically they didn't want to live under your conditionalities. For me, as speaking now as an analyst, but also as a citizen, I wish my government, I want my government to go where some discipline, some strictures will be placed on what it does with the loan facility it has contracted on behalf of the country, as opposed to no questions asked. You just go and do what you have to do, but pay us. And these are sovereign debts. So whether you pay us it's not your personal bill, it's a bill that accrues to, that it's a burden on the country. You leave that to the future to deal with that. So just again, to summarize my response, I don't care whether governments choose to go with Russia or China or the United States, and I think the Afrobarometer data and Africans are by and large saying that. But I'm saying that I care as to whether you are going to China or to the US or to anywhere to get benefits, to get loans, to get assistance, to benefit and to serve your country or to serve your party, your regime, and maybe your cronies and yourself.
Thank you for your vote of confidence on our role as an agency of restraint.
It's relative.
It's relative, indeed, relative.
It's relative.
But I wanted to ask, just on this point, but of course we want to come to a time when you have more internal mechanisms sure. that ensure that. Sure. What do you see missing in that regard? This point that you made about governments going out and borrowing quite a bit, and I'm sure part of it has gone towards infrastructure, but also some difficult decisions have been avoided. Continuing to rely on borrowing rather than, say, on economizing on spending or more domestic revenue mobilization. What is it that you think is missing to strengthen the economic governance in this area?
Well, I think you give an indirect excuse to our governments for having borrowed to address the infrastructure gap. But I think even in there, there's been also a tendency to overprice infrastructure. So again, the same factor of misgovernance, where needed infrastructure development project is taking place, but because of misgovernance, the markups are high and all kinds of percentages are added onto it, and badly designed, kind of bad contracts. So we need to address that. Unfortunately, I mean, that is not necessarily going to come voluntarily from African governments. So the global community, the international community, has to be working both with governments and with domestic civil society and private sectors to address those issues. There was a time as part of the reform of the Paris Agreement where domestic civil society actors were consulted quite actively, sometimes brought into the same room where the finance minister and others were sort of talking about benchmarks, governance benchmarks that have been addressed, social protection programs that were agreed on, having been delivered and so on. I thought that was a better framework for doing country dialogue than what I see today, where there is civil society consultation, but that's outside of official corridors, and then all of their inputs may be taken, and then you guys go into closed doors. I would like to see. I think we all be better served whether a loan is being contracted for infrastructure or whatever. Will be better served if the benchmarks that have been agreed on, which generally tend to be good benchmarks, are monitored collectively. That's within country, by state actors, non-state actors, private sector, and others, because then you get more honesty.
So, I mean, a lot of what you say resonates, and absolutely in terms of making sure that government spending, you get value for money,
yes,
is one of the big challenges that we face, including particularly in kind of capital projects.
Yes.
And we have, of course, we do technical work on best practices on how to do that. But if I may, isn't it the job of Parliament, accountability bodies, Accountant General's office, to do this scrutiny? I mean, yes, of course, external players can make a contribution, but isn't it primarily those bodies that we want to do this so that the social contract in our countries can strengthen a bit more? Huh?
And I admit that, so some of these, in the last 30 years or so, I've been around these issues, at least in Ghana and maybe in a few other places I follow on the continent. Some of the gaps in, for instance, the annual auditing, the Auditor General's offices have been fixed quite a bit. But think of in the post-COVID era, the Auditor Generals who have tried to stand up to governments and have been quite stringent in trying to do their work, have also been harassed and hounded out by government, Ghana included, Sierra Leone, for instance. So these institutions have been rehabilitated. Their capacities have improved. Now that they are able to bite, you get governments who find this new era a little bit too difficult to live under, turning the screws on these same agencies, hollowing out some of their leadership, politicizing the leadership, and so on. So again, in situations like that, I think we all have the international financial institutions, the development community, and then domestic civil society, private sector. We all have a duty to go to the defense of these embattled institution leaders, because after all, these are the guardrails of accountable governance and good governance.
Thank you so much, Professor Emmanuel Boadi. Before, one final question for you, and a more broader one. Huh? So overall, do you remain optimistic about the direction of travel, both for politics and democratic governance in our countries, or more generally just our continent and how we will do going forward?
I'm a natural optimist. I cannot allow myself to be pessimistic. And it's not just putting my head in the sand. It's also sometimes what I see around me. So, who would have thought? We all thought Senegal was going to go nowhere, but Senegalese society writ large, Senegalese civil society, Senegalese academia, Senegalese scholars and professionals came together to save the day. I also, I'm 70 years old now, but I do see a lot of hope in young people in terms of this group that I call the Democratic Anti-Authoritarian Resistance Army, the type that you saw at work at the toll booth in Lekki in Nigeria in 2020, what young people did to basically stop the government from continuing with this rogue state police organization. You've seen some of the same actions even this week on the streets of Nairobi and so on. I generally think that we do have a youth group that is not as timid as maybe my generation was, that is resourceful, and that has the savvy in terms of how to use social media tools and technology to challenge governments. I hope that they don't relent and that they force leadership to deliver better governance.
Thank you so much, Professor. Really very inspirational, and your optimism is really infectious.
I hope so too.
And also kind of, just the lessons that we have to take from the past to move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again at the next Africa Perspective event, hopefully in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.